The baby wasn't crying. That was dangerous. Lars Thorson took the infant from the frozen woman's arms and pressed him against his bare chest. Outside, the worst blizzard in Dakota history screamed at 60 miles an hour. The temperature had dropped 86 degrees in a single afternoon. Across the territory, children were freezing in schoolhouses. Fathers were dying 12 feet from their own front doors. Inside Lars's shelter, buried under 3 feet of frozen earth, the thermometer read 51 degrees. No fire, no stove, just dirt and physics, and a theory every neighbor said would kill him. The baby's skin was gray. His body was limp. Lars held him against his heart and waited. 6 months earlier, Lars had arrived in Dakota Territory with $37, 2 children, and an idea so strange that the most experienced settler in the county told him to file relinquishment and leave before he got his family killed. He had no money for coal, no timber on his land, no way to heat a conventional shelter through a Dakota winter where temperatures dropped to 40 below. So he built something no one had ever seen. He dug into a hillside, covered it with iron and earth, and told his neighbors the ground itself would keep them warm. They called him the Gopher Man. They said he was digging his own grave. Now the man who laughed loudest was in Lars's shelter with a dying son, begging for the warmth that everyone said was impossible. The baby still wasn't moving. The wind hit 50 miles an hour sometime after dark. Lars Thorson stopped counting when the roar outside became constant, a sound like a locomotive that never passed. Inside his shelter, buried under 3 feet of frozen earth, the temperature held at 51 degrees. His children were asleep. Ingrid, 8 years old, had her arm around her brother Eric, who was 5. They lay under wool blankets on a bed of pine boards and straw, breathing slowly, undisturbed by the howl above. The oil lamp on the shelf cast a yellow glow across earthen walls that sweated no moisture, cracked in no draft. The thermometer Lars had carried from Norway read steady. It had not moved in 6 hours. Outside, the territory was dying. Lars knew this without seeing it. He knew that the temperature had dropped 40 degrees since mid-afternoon. He knew the snow was so fine it penetrated wool, leather, every gap in every wall. He knew families in frame houses were feeding their furniture to their stoves and praying the wood lasted until morning. Then the pounding came. 3 strikes against the outer door of the vestibule, then silence, then 3 more, weaker. Lars pulled on his coat and opened the inner door. Cold air rushed in, not the killing cold of the surface, but the buffer cold of the entrance tunnel. He unlatched the outer door. Heinrich Müller fell across the threshold. His beard was white with ice. His lips were gray. Behind him, barely visible in the shrieking white, stood his wife, Greta, clutching an infant against her chest. Lars dragged them inside, sealed the doors. The temperature in the shelter dropped 4 degrees from the intrusion, then stabilized. Muller looked up from where he lay on the packed earth floor. 6 months ago, he had stood on this same ground and told Lars that he was digging his own grave. Now Muller's voice cracked through frozen lips. "It's warmer in here than my house. How is it warmer with no fire?" Lars didn't answer. He was looking at the infant Johann, 3 months old. The baby wasn't crying. That was dangerous. "Give him to me," Lars said. He took the child, opened his own shirt, and pressed the small body against his bare chest. Skin to skin, the only heat that might save him now. 6 months earlier, Lars Thorson had arrived in Dakota Territory with $37, 2 children who still cried for their mother, and an idea that every settler in Griggs County said would kill them all. The land office in Cooperstown smelled like pine sap and tobacco spit. Lars stood at the counter with his homestead filing in one hand and his last $40 in the other. The clerk took 18 for fees and handed back 22. Lars tucked the bills into his coat, knowing the arithmetic that would haunt him all summer. $22. 160 acres of treeless prairie, 2 children under 10, and winter coming in 4 months. The clerk must have seen something in his face. You got people meeting you? Family already established? No. Experience farming this country? No. The clerk leaned back. Mister, I process 30 claims a week. Half of them are back here inside 2 years, filing relinquishment. The ones who make it have either money or kin. You say you got neither. I have experience with the cold. Where? Minnesota? Wisconsin? Norway and the war. The clerk shrugged. Your funeral. Claims registered. Quarter section 12 miles northeast, section U, 14. Good luck finding it. Lars found it. The survey stakes were still standing, rusted iron in the June grass. He walked the boundaries with Ingrid and Eric trailing behind, measuring the land that was now theirs. 160 acres of nothing, no trees, no water visible, a gentle roll in the terrain near the northeast corner where spring runoff had carved a shallow depression into a low rise. He stood in that depression for a long time. Out of the wind, warmer by a few degrees just from the shape of the earth. That night, camped in the wagon, Lars did the math again. To survive a Dakota winter, he needed shelter and heat. A frame house cost $700 minimum, often more. He had 22. A sod house cost almost nothing to build. The material was free, but sod houses still needed fuel. 8 cords of wood minimum, old-timers said. Sometimes 10. A cord of wood cost $4 if you could find it for sale. More often, you cut it yourself. But there were no trees on his claim. The nearest timber stood 40 miles west in the Cheyenne River breaks. 8 cords of wood. $32 he didn't have. 40 miles each way he couldn't travel without leaving his children alone. A bad shoulder from a rebel bullet at Vicksburg that meant he couldn't swing an axe for 10 hours straight even if he found the trees. The other option was coal. $6 a ton at the railroad depot when the trains were running. 4 tons minimum for winter, $24. He had 22, and he still needed food, seed, a stove, lamp oil, and 100 other things that stood between his family and death. He could not afford to heat a conventional shelter. The math was absolute. So he would have to build a shelter that didn't need heat. Carl Lindquist arrived on the 3rd day. He came on a gray mare, moving slow, a man in his late 50s with a face like cracked leather and eyes that had seen too many things. He introduced himself as Lars's nearest established neighbor, 8 miles south, and said he'd heard a Norwegian had filed on Section 14. Come to see if you know what you're getting into, Lindquist said. His accent was Swedish, softened by decades in America. Most don't. Lars showed him the claim, the wagon, the children sitting in the grass, watching. Lindquist studied it all without expression. Then he asked the question Lars had been waiting for. Where's your wife? Dead. Typhoid. 4 months ago. Lindquist nodded slowly. He didn't offer condolences. On the frontier, death was too common for ceremony. So it's just you and them. Yes. And you've got how much money? Enough. Lindquist's expression said he knew that was a lie. He dismounted and walked the depression near the northeast corner, the same ground Lars had stood on. He kicked at the soil, looked at the slope, looked back at Lars. What are you planning to build? A shelter. What kind? Lars hesitated. He hadn't spoken the idea aloud yet. Saying it would make it real and make him sound like a fool, but Lindquist was waiting, and Lars needed to know if he was right. An earth shelter, Lars said, dug into this slope, covered with 3 feet of soil, no fire needed. Lindquist stared at him. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he laughed, a short, harsh sound with no humor in it. An earth shelter, like a root cellar. Bigger, 16 by 20 feet, room for the 3 of us. And you think dirt is going to keep you warm when it's 40 below? The ground doesn't get that cold. 10 feet down, it stays near 50 degrees year-round. Even 3 feet of cover holds the temperature stable. The earth acts as a blanket. Lindquist shook his head. I've been in this territory 9 years. I've buried 17 people. You know what killed most of them? Ideas. Clever ideas from clever men who thought they knew better than the people who'd already survived here. He gestured at depression. You bury yourself in that hillside, you're going to be colder than a man in a sod house with a good stove. The ground doesn't make heat, it just holds cold. The ground holds the average, Lars said. 50 degrees in winter, 50 degrees in summer. I've seen it work. Where? Norway. My grandfather built a storehouse into a hill, same temperature inside, January or July. Lindquist mounted his horse. Norway isn't Dakota. I don't know what your grandfather built, but I know what I've seen. You need 8 cords of wood minimum. A man alone can't cut that, not with children to mind. You need to find a wife, or find partners, or file relinquishment and go back where you came from. He looked at Ingrid and Eric. Before you get those kids killed. He rode south without looking back. Lars watched him go. Then he looked at his children. Ingrid was watching him with eyes too old for 8 years. She had heard everything. Are we going to die, Papa? Lars knelt in front of her. No. The man said, the man is wrong. I'm going to build something he's never seen, and we're going to be warm all winter without burning a single stick of wood. Ingrid looked at the empty prairie, the treeless horizon, the shallow depression in the hillside that didn't look like anything at all. How? Lars took her hand. I'll show you. The memory came to him that night, sharp and clear as the day it happened. Vicksburg, Mississippi, summer of 1863. The siege had lasted 37 days, and Lars's regiment, the 15th Wisconsin, almost entirely Norwegian, was dug into the yellow clay hills surrounding the city. The Confederates held the high ground and the big guns, and every day they dropped shells into the Union positions like rain. The men who survived learned to build bomb-proofs. They dug into the hillsides, cut timber from the surrounding forests, laid logs across the top of their holes, and piled earth on top. 7 feet of soil, minimum, their captain said. 7 feet stops everything but a direct hit. Lars remembered the first time he crawled into a finished bomb-proof during a bombardment. Explosions above, dirt trickling from the ceiling, and cool air. The Mississippi summer outside was brutal, over 100 degrees in the sun. Inside the bomb-proof, it felt like a cellar, 60 degrees, maybe less. He'd asked an officer about it. The officer shrugged. Ground's always cool underground. Same reason wells give cold water. Doesn't matter what the air's doing up top. Lars hadn't forgotten, but he'd never thought to use it for anything but surviving artillery. Not until now. The second memory was older. The farm in Telemark, Norway. His grandfather's stabber, a traditional storehouse built into the hillside behind the main house. Walls of timber, roof of layered turf and birch bark, 3 feet of soil and grass on top. His grandmother stored milk, cheese, dried meat in the stabur. In the depths of January, when the air outside dropped to 30 below, the stabber stayed above freezing. In July, when the summer sun warmed the valley, the stabber stayed cool. Same principle. Earth holds the average. It doesn't matter what the air does. It doesn't matter what the season brings. The ground, 3 feet down, remembers what the temperature was 3 months ago. In January, when Dakota air dropped to 40 below, the ground would still hold autumn's warmth. Lars sat up in the wagon bed, careful not to wake the children. He could see it now, the shape of what he would build. Not a sod house, sod walls insulated, but didn't generate heat. You still needed fire. Not a dugout, too cramped, too prone to collapse. Something new, something that combined what he'd learned in the war with what his grandfather had known for generations. He would dig into the hillside, excavate a space 16 by 20 feet, 4 feet deep. He would build an arch of timber ribs, curved like the roof of a church, so the war. Weight of the earth pressed down and outward rather than straight through. He would cover the arch with corrugated iron sheets to make it waterproof. Then he would bury the whole thing under 3 feet of soil, topped with sod for drainage. The earth would be his furnace. Body heat and a single oil lamp would raise the interior another 5 or 10 degrees. 50 degrees at the coldest nights. Maybe higher. It would work. The physics demanded it. But if he was wrong, if the theory failed in practice, there would be no second chance. His children would freeze in a shelter too strange for anyone to salvage, and Lindquist would bury them in the spring thaw and shake his head about clever ideas from clever fools. Lars lay back down. Eric stirred beside him, small body seeking warmth. He had no choice. Conventional survival was mathematically impossible. This was the only path. In the morning, he began to dig. The shovel bit into Dakota clay with a sound like tearing cloth. Lars lifted, turned, dropped the soil onto the growing pile beside the excavation. Lifted, turned, dropped. 8 hours a day, 10 when the light held. The foundation took 18 days. He dug alone. Ingrid watched Eric during the day, fed him from their dwindling food stores, brought Lars water at noon and again at dusk. The work was brutal, 4 feet down into soil that turned from soft loam to dense clay within the first 2 feet. His bad shoulder screamed. He learned to dig with his right arm only, bracing the shovel against his hip when he needed leverage. By July 15th, the hole was complete, 16 by 20 feet, 4 feet deep. The walls were vertical, shored with scrap lumber to prevent collapse. The floor was packed clay, hard as stone. Standing in the excavation, Lars could already feel the difference. Down here, out of the wind, shaded by the earth walls, the air was cooler. Not cold. This was July, but cooler than the surface. 15 degrees, he estimated. Maybe more. The earth was working. Now came the hard part. He hitched his mule to the wagon and drove to Cooperstown. At the lumberyard, he spent $8 on timber, 6 curved pieces of 4x4, steam bent at the mill, plus crossbeams and bracing. At the hardware store, he bought 24 sheets of corrugated iron, $6 total, $2 more for bolts, tar, and a ventilation pipe, $16. His working capital was now $6, plus food stores he estimated would last until September. The clerk at the hardware store watched him load the iron sheets. "You building a machine shed?" "A house." "With iron?" "Under dirt." The clerk squinted at him. "You're the Norwegian on Section 14, the one building a gopher hole." Lars didn't respond. He finished loading and drove back to his claim. The frame took 2 weeks. Each timber rib weighed over 60 pounds. Alone, with his bad shoulder, Lars couldn't lift them into position. Instead, he dug ramp trenches, rolled each rib down into the excavation, then used rope, pulley, and mule to walk them upright into place. The first rib fell 3 times before holding. The 6th rib went up in an afternoon. By August 1st, The skeleton stood complete. 6 curved ribs spanning the 16-foot width, spaced 3 feet apart, meeting at the crown 8 feet above the floor. The shape looked like a chapel or a whale's rib cage. Heinrich Miller came to watch on August 3rd. He was Lars's nearest neighbor, a German immigrant, young, practical, building a proper frame house on the claim to the east. His wife Greta had brought food once, stew and bread, and stayed to play with Ingrid while Lars worked. Muller himself had only nodded from a distance. Now he stood at the edge of the excavation, looking down at the timber arch. "What is this?" Lars climbed out of the hole. His hands were cracked and bleeding. He'd lost weight. His trousers hung loose at the waist. "Earth shelter. Roof goes on next. Then I bury it." Mueller walked around the excavation, studying the ribs from different angles. "You're going to put dirt on top of this?" 3 feet. Mueller did quick math in his head. Lars watched him reach the answer, the weight of that much soil, pressing down on the timber arch. "That's 40 tons, Mueller said. "More if it gets wet. This frame won't hold that." "It will." The arch shape transfers the load outward. Compression, not bending. "You've built this before?" "I've built bomb-proofs in the war. 7 feet of earth on top. They held." Mueller shook his head. "This isn't a bomb-proof. This is a house with your children inside." He pointed at the ribs. 1 weak joint, 1 timber that cracks, and the whole thing comes down. You'll be buried alive. "The joints will hold. And the cold? Even if the structure holds, you're putting your family underground. Dirt doesn't make heat. A root cellar stays cool because it's not heated. You're planning to live in a root cellar in January." "The ground temperature." "I know what you think about ground temperature. Lindquist told me. He said you've got some theory from Norway." Muller's voice wasn't hostile, just worried. "I've got a wife and a baby coming this winter. I can't watch those children freeze because their father had a theory." Lars met his eyes. "What do you suggest?" Mueller hesitated. Then, "Let me help you build a proper sod house. Smaller than this, but proven. I'll loan you money for a stove and enough coal to start the winter. You can pay me back after harvest." It was a generous offer. Lars knew what it cost Mueller to extend credit he might never recover. "Thank you," Lars said. "But no." Mueller stood silent for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back toward his own claim, shaking his head. "Your children," he said over his shoulder. "Think about your children." Lars watched him go. Then he climbed back into the excavation and continued bolting crossbeams between the ribs. He thought about nothing else. The corrugated iron went up in 4 days. 24 sheets overlapping like fish scales, bolted to the timber ribs with a 1/4-inch gap sealed by pine tar. The work was awkward. Lars had to climb the ribs like a ladder, holding each sheet in place with one hand while driving bolts with the other. Twice he slipped. Once he fell, landing hard on the clay floor, his shoulder flaring with pain that kept him down for an hour. Ingrid watched from the edge of the excavation. She had stopped asking if they were going to die. Now she just watched, quiet, holding Eric's hand. On August 20th, the skin was complete. The shelter looked like a metal whale buried nose first in the hillside, a curved silver arc protruding from the slope, waiting to be swallowed by the earth. The covering began. Lars shoveled dirt onto the roof, 1 load at a time, each shovelful 15 pounds, each cubic yard 2,000 pounds, roughly. He needed 36 cubic yards. At 3 yards per day, the maximum his body could sustain, he needed 12 days minimum, more likely 15 with rest days, with the weather that rolled through unpredictably, with the hours lost to feeding children, hauling water, keeping them alive while he buried himself alive. September 2nd, first frost on the grass, the ground beginning to harden at night. Lars worked faster. His body broke down in stages. First the hands, blisters became calluses, became cracks that bled into the soil he shoveled. Then the back, a constant ache that became sharp pain, that became numbness he couldn't tell from paralysis. Then the shoulder, the old wound flaring, the arm growing weak, the shovel feeling heavier every day. He stopped eating midday meals, saved the food for the children. He stopped sleeping through the night. Woke at 4, worked by moonlight until the sun rose. September 8th. 2/3 of the earth piled, 1/3 to go. Muller appeared at dawn with a shovel over his shoulder. He didn't explain. He didn't speak at all. He just climbed down into the excavation, started shoveling dirt onto the roof, and worked beside Lars for the rest of the day. At dusk, Lars finally spoke. "I thought you said I was burying myself." "You are." Mueller didn't pause his rhythm. "But I'm not going to watch you do it alone." They worked together for 3 days, 8 cubic yards each day, twice what Lars could do alone. The earth rose around the metal arch, swallowing it inch by inch. On September 11th, Mueller stopped. The pile of loose soil was exhausted. The shelter was covered. Lars stood back and looked at what they'd built. A grass-covered hillside. A mound that looked almost natural, except for the dark rectangle of the entrance tunnel on the south-facing slope and the 6-inch pipe rising from the earth at the crown. "It's done," Mueller said. "The covering is done. I still need to finish the inside." Mueller nodded. He was filthy, exhausted, his German stubbornness the only thing that had kept him shoveling. "If this works, if you survive the winter in there, I want you to show me how to build one." "You said the frame won't hold." "I said 1 weak joint and you're buried alive. I still think so." Mueller shouldered his shovel. "But you didn't give me a weak joint. I checked every one while we worked." He looked at the mound one more time. "I hope you're right about the temperature. I hope to God you're right." He walked back towards his claim. Lars watched him go, then turned to face the entrance of his earth-covered shelter. 38 tons of soil overhead, 6 timber ribs holding it up, and everything he'd gambled on, a theory from his grandfather and a memory from the war. He went inside. The interior smelled like wet clay and pine tar. Lars stood in the center of the space, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. Light filtered through the entrance tunnel, soft, gray, indirect. The air was cool, not cold, not warm. Cool. He struck a match, lit the oil lamp he'd hung from the center rib. The flame illuminated earthen walls, timber arches, the curved metal ceiling hidden beneath its burden of soil. Shadows danced in the corners. The space felt smaller than he'd designed, only 16 by 20 feet, but underground, wrapped in earth, it seemed to compress around him. He walked to the back wall and placed his hand against the packed clay. Cool, dry, no moisture seeping through. He checked the ventilation pipe, a 6-inch tube running from the floor level, up through the earth, and out into the open air above. He lit another match and held it near the base of the pipe. The flame flickered, bent, pulled sideways toward the opening. Airflow. The thermal draft was working, cool air entering through the low pipe, warm air exiting through small gaps near the roof peak. Circulation. He checked the entrance vestibule, the L-shaped tunnel he dug into the hillside with 2 doors 10 feet apart. Never open both at once. The vestibule was an airlock, the buffer between inside and outside. He hung the thermometer on the center rib and watched it. After 1 hour, it read 54 degrees. Outside, the September air was 62. After 6 hours, it still read 54. The earth was holding. October came cold. Lars finished the interior in the first 2 weeks. Floor of packed earth covered with straw, covered with pine boards salvaged from packing crates. Beds built from rough lumber along the east wall, a small table and 2 stools, shelves for food, lamp oil, tools. The children's clothes hung from pegs driven into the timber ribs. On October 15th, he moved his family underground. Ingrid stood in the entrance for a long moment, looking around. The space was dim, lit only by the oil lamp and the gray light from the tunnel. It smelled of earth and straw and the faint chemical tang of whitewash on the walls. "It's like a cave," she said. "It's our home." Eric pressed against her leg, uncertain. He was 5, old enough to know that other families lived in houses that had windows and didn't have dirt for ceilings. "Will we be warm?" Ingrid asked. Lars showed her the thermometer. 54 degrees, and it will stay near that all winter, no matter how cold it gets outside. "Without fire?" "Without fire." She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much in 8 years. Her mother's death, the journey west, her father digging himself into a hill while neighbors called him a fool. "Mr. Lindquist said you were going to kill us." Mr. Lindquist was wrong. "How do you know?" Lars knelt in front of her. "Because I've seen this work before. In Norway, where I was born. In the war, where I fought. The earth keeps its own temperature. It doesn't care what the weather does. We're going to be safe in here, I promise." She held his eyes for a long moment. Then she nodded. That night, the 3 of them slept, underground for the first time. Lars lay awake, listening. The wind had picked up outside. He could hear it faintly, a distant moan. But the walls of his shelter didn't shake. The air didn't move. The temperature held at 52 degrees. When he finally slept, he dreamed of his grandfather's stabur, the smell of dried fish and aged cheese, the coolness in summer, the warmth in winter, the way the earth held everything steady while the world outside changed with the seasons. When he woke, the thermometer still read 52. The earth was keeping its promise. But winter hadn't truly arrived yet. November brought the first real cold. The temperature outside dropped below 0 on November 8th. Lars checked his thermometer at dawn. Outside 3 degrees below 0. Inside 51 degrees, a 54-degree difference. No fire. He walked to Muller's claim that afternoon. Muller's frame house was well built, tight walls, good chinking, a cast iron stove burning coal at a steady rate. Inside, Greta served coffee. The baby was due in 6 weeks. "How cold does it get in here?" Lars asked. Mueller shrugged. "We keep the stove fed, 65, 70 degrees. Colder when the fire dies down overnight." "How much coal have you burned this month?" Mueller calculated. "Half a ton, maybe. We'll need another 3 tons to get through winter." $18 at least. I know what coal costs. Lars sipped his coffee. "My shelter was 51 degrees this morning. No fire, no fuel." Mueller set down his cup. 51? I can show you the thermometer." "That's impossible." "I thought so too, before I understood. The ground isn't cold, Heinrich. It only feels cold because we're warm. Go into any cave, any mine, any root cellar. It's the same temperature year-round, 50 degrees. The earth holds the average of what the air has been over months, not what it is today." Mueller stared at him. You're telling me it's 50 degrees underground. Right now, while it's 3 below on the surface? I'm telling you I checked this morning. If you don't believe me, come see. Muller came the next day. He stood inside Lars's shelter with his hand against the wall, feeling the temperature of the earth. He looked at the thermometer. He watched his breath, barely visible, a faint mist, nothing like the clouds that formed in his own house when the stove burned low. I don't understand, he said. The earth is a thermal mass. It stores heat in summer, releases it in winter. 3 feet of soil acts like a blanket that smooths out the temperature swings. Right now, this earth still holds October's warmth. By March, it will still hold December's cold, but December's cold is 50 degrees, not 30 below. Muller shook his head slowly. Lindquist needs to see this. Lindquist won't come. He made up his mind 6 months ago. Then I'll make him come. But Lindquist didn't come. The old Swede sent word through a neighbor. He'd seen enough fool ideas to last a lifetime. If Thorson's hole was still standing in March, he'd reconsider. The word spread anyway. The Norwegian on Section 14 was living underground, no fire, no coal, and somehow, impossibly, his children weren't freezing. Some settlers rode by to look, shake their heads, and leave. Others sent questions through Muller. How deep was the excavation? How thick was the earth cover? What about moisture, mold, air quality? Lars answered everything. He had nothing to hide. The physics were simple. The execution was hard labor. Anyone could do it if they understood and committed. But December brought no converts. The idea was too strange, too different from everything the settlers knew about surviving winter. They would wait, they said. Wait and see if the Norwegian was still alive in spring, December 25th, Christmas Day. Lars gave Ingrid a wooden doll he'd carved from a broken shovel handle. He gave Eric a spinning top made from a spool and a sharpened nail. They laughed, playing on the floor of the shelter, while the temperature outside dropped to 28 below zero. Inside, 49 degrees. Lars recorded it in the notebook he'd started keeping. Every morning, every evening, outside temperature, inside temperature, fuel consumed. The fuel column remained blank. 0. Nothing. He'd spent $4 on lamp oil since October. That was his entire heating cost. Muller had spent $32 on coal and was calculating whether his remaining supply would last until the railroad ran again in spring. The Krantz family, 2 miles north, had run out of coal on December 20th. They were burning furniture. When the furniture ran out, they would burn the walls of their house. When the walls ran out, they would freeze. Lars heard about the Krantzes from a settler passing through. He hitched his mule and drove to their claim that afternoon. The Krantz house was a single-room frame structure, barely 12 by 14 feet. Inside, a woman, a man, and 3 children huddled around a stove that was burning a broken chair. The temperature inside was perhaps 40 degrees. The children's lips were blue. "I have a shelter," Lars said. "It stays above 50 without fire. You can stay with us until the weather breaks." Otto Krantz looked at him with hollow eyes. "The Norwegian with the gopher hole." "Yes. I heard about your hole. Heard you'd be dead by Christmas." "It's Christmas. I'm not dead. And my shelter is warmer than your house right now." Krantz looked at his wife, his children, the broken furniture that was all they had left to burn. "How far?" 2 miles. "The children can't walk 2 miles in this cold." "Then I'll take them in the wagon, bundle them in blankets. It's a 15-minute ride." Krantz hesitated. Pride warred with desperation on his face. His wife spoke. "Otto, the children." Krantz closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had broken inside. Him, the thing that made men cling to stupid decisions because admitting error felt like death. "All right," he said, "show us your hole." The shelter had been designed for 3. With the Krantz family, it held 8, 16 by 20 feet, 8 bodies generating heat. The temperature rose to 56 degrees the first night and stayed there. They slept in shifts, children on the beds, adults on blankets on the floor. They ate from Lars's food stores, which he calculated would now last half as long. But the calculations didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that 5 children were warm instead of dying. Otto Krantz stood in the center of the shelter on the second day, staring at the thermometer. 56 degrees, he said. "It's 20 below outside and 56 in here. No fire. The earth holds the heat." "I've never heard of such a thing." "Now you've felt it." Krantz turned to face him. His eyes were wet with relief or shame or something between. "I laughed. When I heard what you were building, I told my wife the Norwegian was going to kill his children." "Many people said that." "I was wrong." "Yes." Krantz wiped his eyes. "If we survive this winter, when we survive it, I want you to show me how to build this. I don't care if people laugh. I don't care if they call it a gopher hole. My children are warm." Lars nodded. "I'll show anyone who wants to learn." The Krantzes stayed for 11 days, until the January thaw allowed them to travel to town and buy emergency supplies on credit. When they left, Otto Krantz shook Lars's hand and held it for a long moment. "I owe you my family's lives," he said. "You owe me nothing. Just remember what you learned." Krantz nodded. Then he loaded his wife and children into their wagon and drove toward Cooperstown, leaving tracks in the snow that led away from the shelter that had saved them. January 10th. The temperature rose. Lars felt the change before he checked the thermometer. The air outside had lost its killing edge. When he opened the vestibule doors, he didn't feel the instant burn of extreme cold. Outside 28 degrees, practically balmy. The children ran in the snow, the first time in weeks they'd been able to play outside without risking frostbite. Ingrid threw snowballs at Eric. Eric shrieked and ran, falling into drifts, laughing. Lars watched them and felt something unclench in his chest. They had made it. Almost 3 months of winter survived. His shelter worked. His theory held. Another 2 months and spring would come. The thaw would begin, and he would start teaching others what he'd learned. The worst was over. That's what he told himself on January 10th. On January 11th, the temperature rose to 38 degrees. Settlers talked about an early spring. Children went to school in light coats. On January 12th, just after 3 in the afternoon, the sky turned black. The wall of white hit the territory like a fist. Lars was inside the shelter when the air pressure changed. His ears popped. The children looked up from their game on the floor, sensing something wrong. Then the sound came, a roar that built from nothing to everything in seconds. A freight train that didn't pass, that settled over the land and stayed. He moved to the vestibule and opened the inner door. Through the outer door's cracks, he saw it. Snow so thick it erased the world. Not falling, driving, horizontal. The flakes were fine as flour, pushed by wind that screamed at 50 miles an hour, then 60. The temperature was already dropping. He could feel it through the walls of the entrance tunnel, the cold pressing in, seeking any gap, any weakness. He sealed both doors and returned to the main chamber. "What's happening?" Ingrid asked. "Blizzard. A bad one." "How bad?" Lars checked the thermometer. 58 degrees inside. He didn't know what it was outside anymore. His external thermometer was mounted on a post near the entrance. and he wasn't going out to read it. Bad enough that we stay inside, no matter what. Eric crawled into his sister's lap. The roar outside was constant now, a vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The shelter's earthen walls muffled it, but couldn't eliminate it. They were underground, wrapped in 38 tons of frozen soil, and still the storm found ways to remind them it was there. The first hour passed. The temperature inside dropped to 56 degrees, then 55. The thermal mass of the Earth was buffering the assault, but even the Earth had limits. Every degree lost was heat that wouldn't return until spring. Lars lit a second oil lamp. The additional flame raised the temperature 1 degree. He calculated, with body heat from 3 people and 2 lamps burning, they could hold above 50 degrees indefinitely. Uncomfortable, but survivable. The storm disagreed. The pounding came 2 hours after dark. 3 strikes against the outer, Dauker. Silence. 3 more, weaker. Lars's first thought, the Krantzes. They'd gone back to their claim after the thaw. If they'd been caught without fuel again, he pulled on his coat and opened the inner door. The vestibule was 10 degrees colder than the main chamber. He could feel the storm trying to claw through the outer door, pressing against every crack. He unlatched the door and pulled. Heinrich Müller fell inside. His face was white with frost. His beard was solid ice. He tried to speak and couldn't. His lips were frozen together. Lars dragged him into the vestibule and slammed the door against the shrieking white. Greta, Müller finally managed. Johann, still in the house. Lars's blood went cold. Müller's frame house was 1 mile east. In this wind, in this visibility, 1 mile was a death sentence. How bad is it in your house? Stove can't keep up. Temperature dropping. 20 degrees inside when I left. Maybe lower now. 20 degrees. Johann was 3 months old. A baby couldn't survive 20 degrees for long. Why did you come here? Müller's eyes were wild. I thought I could make it to you, bring help back. You can't go back out there. You'll die. My wife, my son. Lars looked at the outer door. Through the gaps, the wind howled. Snow had already drifted against the bottom, 6 inches in the 2 minutes the door had been open. He thought of Ingrid and Eric in the main chamber. If he went out and didn't come back, they would survive. The shelter would hold. They had food and water for weeks. Someone would find them in the spring, but Greta and Johann had hours, maybe less. Stay here, Lars said. Watch my children. You can't. Lars was already pulling rope from the hook on the vestibule wall. 50 feet of hemp line, coiled tight. He tied one end around his waist and the other to the timber beam that braced the vestibule. If I'm not back in 1 hour, don't come looking. Stay with the children, promise me. Müller grabbed his arm. I should go. They're my family. You're half frozen. You won't make it 200 yards. Lars pulled on his gloves, wrapped a wool scarf around his face, leaving only his eyes exposed. 1 hour. Then you seal this door and don't open it until the storm breaks. He didn't wait for a response. He opened the outer door and stepped into the white. The wind hit him like a wall. He staggered, caught himself, leaned into it. The snow wasn't falling. It was flying. Horizontal needles that found every gap in his clothing, every inch of exposed skin. He couldn't see his hand in front of his face. He couldn't see the ground beneath his feet. He turned east. Müller's house was 1 mile due east. He knew this because he'd walked it a dozen times in daylight, in calm weather, when the world made sense. Now the world was gone. There was only white and wind, and the rope playing out behind him. He counted paces. 100, 200. The rope reached its limit and pulled taut against his waist. He untied it. From here, he was on his own. The wind came from the northwest. That much he knew from how the storm had hit. If he kept the wind on his left cheek, he would travel east. Simple navigation. Except the wind swirled and gusted, changing direction by degrees, and his face was going numb, and he couldn't tell left from right anymore. He walked 300 paces, 400. The cold was inside him now, past the coat, past the wool, into his bones. His bad shoulder ached with a pain that felt like fire and ice at once. His lungs burned with every breath of frozen air. 500 paces. He should be halfway there. He should see something. The dark shape of a building, a fence post, anything. But there was only white. 600, 700. He stopped. Something was wrong. 1 mile was roughly 1,700 paces, his usual stride. At 700, he should have crossed at least one landmark, the frozen creek bed, the slight rise where Mueller had started his fence line. But the ground beneath his feet felt flat and featureless. He was off course. The wind had shifted, or he had drifted, or both. He was walking into the open prairie, away from everything, and every step took him further from both his shelter and Mueller's house. He turned in a circle, trying to orient himself. The wind came from everywhere and nowhere. The white was absolute. Panic rose in his throat. He forced it down. Panic killed faster than cold. Think. The wind was from the northwest when the storm hit. If it had shifted, it shifted clockwise. Weather patterns moved west to east. That meant the wind was now more from the west, which meant he had been drifting south. He turned left, north. He would walk north until he hit something, the section line fence, the creek bed, anything that could tell him where he was. He walked, counted, 200 paces north. His foot hit something hard. He dropped to his knees, scrabbling. In the snow, a fence post, buried nearly to the top in drifts, but solid wood, driven into the frozen ground. Miller's fence line ran east-west along the south edge of his claim. If Lars followed it east, he would reach the house. He grabbed the wire that ran between posts and pulled himself along it, hand over hand, post by post. The wire cut through his gloves. He didn't care. The wire was direction. The wire was life. 1 post, 2, 5, 10. And then, through the white, a shape. The Mueller house was barely visible at 20 feet. Lars staggered to the door and pounded. No answer. He lifted the latch, unlocked, and fell inside. The interior was dark. The stove was cold, dead cold. No embers. Nothing. The temperature felt like a root cellar in autumn, maybe 30 degrees, maybe less. Greta! A sound from the corner, a whimper. Lars stumbled toward it, hands outstretched. His fingers touched wool, a blanket, and beneath it the curve of a woman's back. Greta Mueller was curled around her son, both of them wrapped in every blanket in the house. She looked up at Lars with eyes that didn't quite focus. Heinrich? He's safe, in my shelter. We have to go. Can't walk. Tried. Fell. Lars pulled back the blankets and looked at Johann. The baby was still, not crying, not moving. His skin had a grayish tinge that Lars had seen before on men pulled from snowdrifts during the war, men who never woke up. He didn't have time to check if the baby was alive. He had to move. He wrapped Johann against Greta's chest, binding them together with a blanket twisted into a sling. Then he pulled Greta to her feet. She weighed almost nothing. Or maybe he was too numb to feel the weight, and tied his belt around both of them, linking them together. We're going to walk. Hold on to me. Don't let go. I can't. You can. Your son needs you to. He pulled her toward the door. The wind was waiting. The return was worse. Greta couldn't walk straight. She stumbled every few steps, pulling Lars sideways, threatening to drag them both down. The snow was deeper now, drifts building against every obstacle, filling every depression. They waded through powder that reached Lars's thighs. He found the fence line, followed it west, hand over hand, pulling Greta behind him. The wire was his lifeline. As long as he held the wire, he knew which way was home, but the fence line ended at Muller's property boundary. From there, Lars's shelter was half a mile south and west, across open prairie with no landmarks. He let go of the wire. The white swallowed them. He walked by dead reckoning, keeping the wind on his right cheek, or where he thought his right cheek was, through the numbness that had spread across his face. He counted paces. 500, 600, 700. He should be close. He should see the rise where his shelter was buried. He saw nothing. 800 paces. 900. The numbers weren't working. He was lost again, and this time he had a dying woman and an infant tied to his chest. He stopped. Greta sagged against him, barely conscious. Think. What did he know? His shelter was invisible. That was the point. A grass-covered mound that looked like a natural hillside. In a blizzard, in the dark, he could walk right past it. But there was one part of the shelter that rose above the ground. The ventilation pipe, 6 inches in diameter, extending 3 feet above the surface, drawing air in and out of the earth. The pipe was metal. If he got close enough, he might see it or feel it. He dropped to his knees. The snow was shallower at ground level. The wind blew it into drifts rather than letting it settle evenly. He crawled forward, sweeping his hands through the powder, feeling for anything that wasn't snow. 10 feet, 20. His hands were beyond pain now, somewhere in the realm of wooden objects attached to his wrists. 30 feet. His fingers touched metal. The pipe, cold and smooth and rising from the earth like a signpost to salvation. He followed it down, found the slope of the hillside, found the entrance tunnel, found the door. He pounded. The door opened. Warm air flooded out. Muller's face appeared, white with fear. Greta, help me. They dragged Greta inside, sealed the doors. The temperature hit Lars like a physical force. 51 degrees, warm as summer after what he'd been through. But Johann wasn't moving. Lars took the baby from Greta's arms. The infant was limp. His skin was cold. His color was wrong, that grayish tinge that meant the body was shutting down, pulling blood from the extremities, trying to save the vital organs. Lars had seen men pulled from the Mississippi in winter during the war. The surgeons had a technique for the ones who weren't breathing: body heat, skin to skin, force warmth into the core before the heart stopped. He opened his shirt, pressed Johann against his bare chest, wrapped his coat around both of them, creating a cocoon. Is he alive? Greta's voice was barely a whisper. Lars didn't answer. He couldn't feel anything. His hands were too numb, and the baby was too still. He held the infant against his heart and waited. Ingrid and Eric were awake, watching from their bed with wide eyes. Muller was holding Greta, rubbing her hands, trying to bring warmth back into her frozen body. 1 minute passed. 2. Lars felt something, a flutter against his chest, faint, like a bird's wing. Then again, stronger. Johann's body twitched, his arms moved, his face contorted. And then the sound, a thin, reedy wail that built into a full-throated scream, the most beautiful sound Lars had ever heard. He's alive, Lars said. He's crying. He's alive. Greta collapsed against her husband, sobbing. Müller held her with one arm and reached for his son with the other. Lars passed the screaming infant to his father and watched Müller's face transform from terror to relief to something that looked like awe. 6 people in a shelter built for 3, 51 degrees, no fire. The storm raged above them. The earth held steady below. The blizzard lasted 36 hours. Lars kept the lamp burning, kept the door sealed, kept checking the thermometer every hour. The lowest reading was 47 degrees at the peak of the storm's fury, colder than he would have liked, but warm enough, survivable. They slept in shifts. The children shared one bed. The adults rotated through the other, 2 sleeping while 4 stayed awake. They ate from Lars's dwindling food stores, salt pork, dried beans, hardtack, and drank water from melted snow. On the morning of January 14th, the wind stopped. Lars opened the vestibule door and looked out at a transformed world. The snow was chest-deep in places, sculpted into dunes and waves by the wind. The sky was clear, brilliant blue, and the sun glinted off the white surface with a brightness that hurt his eyes. The temperature was 0 degrees, warm compared to what had passed. Müller stood beside him, looking east toward his own claim. The frame house was invisible beneath the drifts. "It's still standing," Lars said. "You'll be able to dig it out when the snow settles." Müller didn't respond. He was staring at the horizon, at the empty white expanse where other homesteads lay buried. "How many people died last night?" he asked. Lars didn't know, but he could guess. The death count reached them in pieces over the following weeks. A rider from Cooperstown brought the first numbers. At least 40 dead in Griggs County and the surrounding area. By February, the territorial total had climbed past 200. By the time the newspapers finished tallying, the schoolhouse blizzard, named for the children it killed, had claimed between 235 and 500 lives across Dakota, Nebraska, and Minnesota. 213 of the dead were children. The stories came with the numbers. Minnie Freeman, a 19-year-old schoolteacher in Nebraska, had led 13 students to safety when the wind ripped the roof off her sod schoolhouse, a mile and a half through blinding snow, all of them tied together with twine. She became a hero. Lois Royce, another teacher, tried to lead 3 students 82 yards to her boarding house. All 3 children froze to death. Royce survived but lost both feet. Etta Shattuck, 19 years old, burrowed into a haystack with frostbitten hands and survived 78 hours before rescue. She died weeks later from the infection that followed amputation. Ole Teisland, 70 years old, froze to death 12 feet from his own front door. He couldn't see it through the snow. In frame houses across the territory, families burned furniture, then floorboards, then the walls themselves, trying to stay alive. When the fuel ran out, so did they. The Larsons, 3 miles northwest of Lars's claim, lost 2 children. The Hendricksons lost their grandmother. The Myers lost everyone, father, mother, and 4 children, found frozen in their beds when the neighbors finally dug through the drifts to check on them. Lars listened to the stories and said nothing. He had no words for the arithmetic of survival, why some lived and others died, why a man with $37 and a strange idea had kept 6 people warm, while families with 10 times his resources had perished. The earth didn't play favorites. It simply held its temperature. If you understood that, you lived. If you didn't, you were at the mercy of the wind. Carl Lindquist came to Lars's claim on January 22nd. The old Swede rode slowly, picking his way through drifts that still rose higher than his horse's belly in places. He tied his mare to the post near the shelter entrance and stood for a long moment looking at the grass-covered mound. Lars came out to meet him. I heard about the storm, Lindquist said. Heard the Millers were with you. They were. Heard the baby almost died. He did almost die. He's alive now. Lindquist nodded slowly. He walked around the shelter, studying the entrance, the ventilation pipe, the way the earth had been shaped to look natural. He stopped at the south-facing slope and placed his hand against the frozen sod. What was the temperature inside? At the worst of it? 47 degrees, lowest reading. And outside? I don't know exactly. 40 below maybe. 50 below with the wind. Lindquist was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was different, the certainty gone, replaced by something that might have been humility. I've buried 17 people in this territory. 18 after last week I helped dig the Henriksen grandmother out of her house. He turned to face Lars. I told you this would kill your children. I told you to file relinquishment and go back to Wisconsin. I remember. I was wrong. Lars didn't respond. There was nothing to say. I've been doing this wrong, Lindquist continued. 9 years in Dakota, and I've been telling people the same thing. Get fuel, get a stove, get a good house. And I've been burying them when the fuel runs out and the stove goes cold and the good house turns into a coffin. He looked at the shelter again, the simple mound of earth that had held warmth when nothing else could. I'd like to learn, he said, if you're willing to teach an old man who thought he knew everything. Lars extended his hand. Lindquist took it. The ground temperature stays near 50 degrees year-round, Lars said. That's where we start. Mueller began building his own earth shelter in April. The design was identical to Lars's, 16 by 20 feet, timber arch frame, corrugated iron skin, 3 feet of earth cover. Lars supervised the construction, checking every joint, every angle, every calculation. The arch is critical, Lars explained. A flat roof can't hold the weight. The curve transfers the load. Outward, compression instead of bending. That's what keeps it from collapsing. Mueller nodded, driving bolts into the timber ribs. His hands knew the work now. He understood. Greta watched from nearby, Johann in her arms. The baby was healthy, no lasting damage from the night he'd almost frozen. When the weather was warm, Greta brought him to the construction site, and the women of the area came to see the Norwegians' method for themselves. Some were skeptical. The same objections Lars had heard a year ago. Dirt doesn't make heat. You'll be living in a root cellar. What about the damp? But more of them looked at Greta and Johann, alive and whole, and decided that skepticism was a luxury they couldn't afford. By July, Müller's shelter was complete. By August, 2 more families had started construction. By the winter of 1888, 6 earth-sheltered structures stood in Griggs County, all built by people who had survived the schoolhouse blizzard, or known someone who hadn't. The method spread through the Norwegian and Swedish communities first. They recognized it, the turf roofs of their grandparents, the root cellars of the old country. For them, it wasn't a strange new idea. It was a memory they'd almost forgotten. The American-born settlers were slower to adopt. To them, earth shelters looked primitive, something a gopher would build, not a civilized family. They preferred frame houses, even after the blizzard had shown how fragile frame houses could be. Thomas Crane, the land agent who had warned Lars about proper construction, never came to see the shelter. He sent a letter instead. Mr. Thorson, congratulations on your survival. I trust you will consider proper improvements to your claim this summer. The Cooperstown Lumber Company offers competitive rates on quality lumber. As I have always said, a house should be built above the ground, not below it. T. Crane. Lars read the letter and set it aside. Crane had too much invested in the old way to change. His commissions depended on settlers buying lumber and coal. If earth sheltering spread, his business would collapse. Some men couldn't see past their own interests. Lars didn't blame them. He simply built another shelter and taught another family and let the results speak for themselves. The newspaper from Fargo arrived in late January, 3 weeks after the blizzard. A reporter had made the rounds of the devastated territory, collecting stories of survival and loss. Lars found his own name on the third page, in a column titled Remarkable Escapes from the Storm's Fury. The Norwegian settler Lars Thorsen of Section 14 in Griggs County sheltered 6 persons through the worst of the blizzard in what can only be described as an underground house. The structure, built into a hillside and covered with several feet of earth, maintained a temperature above 40 degrees throughout the storm without any fire or fuel. Mr. Thorsen reports that the Earth's natural warmth keeps the interior stable regardless of external conditions. Several neighbors have expressed interest in building similar structures before next winter. Lars folded the newspaper and put it with the letter from Crane. He didn't need the validation. The Earth had already validated him. But he kept the clipping anyway. Someday, when he was gone, someone might want to know how it was done. Someone might need to learn what he had learned. The Earth holds the average. It doesn't matter what the weather does. It doesn't matter what men believe. The physics is simple. The execution is hard labor. Anyone can do it if they understand and commit. Spring came late in 1888. The snow didn't fully melt until mid-April. When it did, the prairie revealed what the blizzard had buried: dead cattle by the thousands, their bodies preserved in the cold until the thaw released them to rot. The stench of decay hung over the territory for weeks. Lars plowed his fields and planted his wheat and watched the earth turn from brown to green. His children helped. Ingrid was 9 now, old enough to handle a seed bag, and Eric at 6 could lead the mule while Lars guided the plow. They were alive. That was enough. In June, a man arrived from Steele County, 50 miles south. He had heard about the earth shelter. He wanted to see it. Lars showed him everything: the construction, the dimensions, the critical details, the arch shape, the minimum 3 feet of earth cover, the ventilation pipes that kept the air fresh and the moisture controlled, the double-door vestibule that created an airlock against the cold. The man took notes, drew sketches, asked questions about soil composition and drainage and load calculations. "Will you come to Steele County?" he asked. "Help us build one?" Lars shook his head. "I can't leave my claim, but I can teach you enough to do it yourself." He spent 2 days with the man from Steele County. At the end, the man shook his hand and rode south with a notebook full of diagrams and a head full of understanding. Lars never learned whether the man built his shelter, but he had given what he could give. The knowledge was out there now, spreading from person to person, claim to claim. That's how things survived, not through books or newspapers, but through hands and eyes and voices. One neighbor teaching another, one generation passing knowledge to the next, the way his grandfather had taught him, in a storehouse built into a Norwegian hillside. The years passed. Lars proved up his homestead in 1892, 5 years after filing. He owned 160 acres free and clear, with no debt and no mortgage. The claim was worth more than he'd spent to build it. The earth shelter had saved thousands of dollars in fuel costs alone. Ingrid grew into a young woman with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. She married Carl Eriksson in 1897, a Norwegian farmer from the next county who had built his own earth shelter after hearing about her father's survival in the blizzard. Eric became a carpenter. He built 6 earth-sheltered structures in his career, not as primary homes, but as storm cellars and root cellars and livestock shelters. Each one used his father's principles: the arch shape, the minimum earth cover, the ventilation system. Lars lived until 1911. He died on the homestead where he had arrived with $37 and two children in the shelter he had built with his own hands from a memory of the war and a tradition from the old country. He was 69 years old. He had outlived his wife by 24 years, but he had never remarried. The shelter was enough company. The earth was enough warmth. After his death, Ingrid inherited the claim. She and Carl maintained the shelter for another decade, using it for storage and as refuge during storms. But their own house was a proper frame building with a coal furnace, and the old ways faded as the new ways took hold. The shelter collapsed in 1923, its timbers finally rotting after 36 years of holding up the earth. By then, no one remembered the Norwegian who had built it or the blizzard he had survived. Sod houses became relics. Earth shelters became curiosities. The railroad brought coal cheaply and reliably, and the idea of living underground seemed primitive, something grandparents had done when they were too poor to build properly. The knowledge faded. The principle was forgotten until someone needed it again. 1973, the Arab oil embargo. Americans waited in line for hours to buy gasoline. Heating oil prices doubled, then tripled. Suddenly, the energy that everyone had taken for granted was scarce and expensive, and people began asking questions they hadn't asked in decades. How did the old-timers survive without fuel? An architect named Malcolm Wells had been asking that question since 1965. He had written an article for progressive architecture called Nowhere to Go But Down, arguing that buildings should be buried under the earth rather than perched on top of it. His colleagues had called him crazy. By 1979, no one was calling him crazy anymore. The University of Minnesota Underground Space Center published a book that year, Earth-Sheltered Housing Design. It became a bestseller among back-to-the-land builders and energy-conscious homeowners. The principles it described were simple. Ground temperature at depth remains stable year-round. Earth provides thermal mass that smooths out temperature swings. A buried structure requires a fraction of the heating and cooling energy of a conventional house. The book cited sod houses and dugouts as precedents. It cited Native American earth lodges and medieval Scandinavian turf houses. It did not cite Lars Thorson of Griggs County, Dakota Territory, because no one remembered his name. But the principles were his principles. The physics was his physics. The understanding that had saved 6 lives in the schoolhouse blizzard was now being rediscovered by engineers and architects who thought they were inventing something new. Modern earth-sheltered homes use concrete and steel and waterproofing membranes that Lars never could have imagined. They cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, more than the entire net worth of every settler in Griggs County combined. But they work the same way. The earth holds the average, 50 degrees give or take. If you live inside the earth, you live in the average. The extremes, the 40 below, the 100 above, happen in the air. Underground, it's always October. A man in Minnesota stands in his earth-sheltered home, built in 2020. The walls are concrete, 18 inches thick, reinforced with steel. The roof is buried under 4 feet of soil, planted with native grasses that bloom in summer. Solar panels on the south-facing slope generate electricity. A heat pump moves warmth from the earth into the living space when needed, which isn't often. His heating bill for the winter, $84. His neighbors in conventional houses pay 10 times that. Outside, a January storm. Inside, 62 degrees, no furnace running. He knows about the schoolhouse blizzard. He read about it in a book about earth-sheltered construction. He knows that 200 people died and that some survived by sheltering in root cellars and dugouts. He knows that the settlers who understood the earth outlived the settlers who fought against it. He doesn't know Lars Thorson's name. No one does. The newspaper clipping from 1888 crumbled to dust decades ago. The shelter collapsed. The children grew old and died. The story faded into the background noise of history, one survival among many, one idea among thousands. But the idea didn't die. It passed from Lars to Müller, from Müller to his neighbors, from the neighbors to their children. It passed through agricultural societies and immigrant communities and back to the land movements. It was forgotten and rediscovered, dismissed and vindicated, buried and resurrected, just like the shelters themselves. The man in Minnesota doesn't know where his house came from. He doesn't know that his 4 feet of earth cover is almost identical to the 3 feet Lars piled on his corrugated iron roof. He doesn't know that his ventilation system uses the same thermal chimney principle that Lars figured out from watching mine shafts and bomb proofs. He only knows that it works. And that's enough. January 12th, 136 years since the blizzard. The wind picks up across the Dakota prairie. The temperature drops. Snow begins to fall. In Griggs County, the population has shrunk from its 19th century peak. Many of the old homesteads are abandoned now, reclaimed by grass and weather. The frame houses rotted. The sod houses melted back into the earth, but somewhere beneath a low rise in Section 14, buried under more than a century of soil and growth, the ghost of a timber arch still holds its shape. The corrugated iron has rusted to nothing. The wood has turned to dust, but the depression in the hillside remains, the negative space where a Norwegian immigrant once dug a shelter and kept his children alive when the world turned white and cold. The earth remembers what men forget. It holds the average, 50 degrees in winter, 50 degrees in summer. The same temperature Lars felt when he first stepped inside his Finnish shelter in October of 1887. The same temperature his grandfather felt in the Stabber in Telemark. The same temperature the man in Minnesota feels in his modern, expensive, architect-designed home. The physics doesn't change. The principle doesn't expire. The earth offers the same bargain it has always offered. Bury yourself in me, and I will keep you warm. Lars Thorsen took that bargain when he had no other choice. He arrived with $37 and 2 children and an idea that every experienced settler said would fail. He dug into a hillside while his neighbors laughed. He buried his roof in dirt while they shook their heads. And when the blizzard came, when the temperature dropped 86 degrees in an afternoon, when the wind hit 60 miles an hour, when children froze in schoolhouses and fathers froze 12 feet from their own front doors, Lars Thorsen sat in his earth-covered shelter at 51 degrees, watching his children sleep. He didn't beat the cold. He simply understood it. The warmth doesn't come from fire. It comes from geometry, from physics, from 38 tons of frozen soil that holds the memory of a warmer season. The earth keeps its promises. You just have to know how to ask,